It's a scenario no policymaker wants to see unfold, a lightning strike on Taiwan that pulls the world's major superpowers into open conflict. In 2025, war planners ask whether an attack could achieve decisive effects in days, not months, and whether Taiwan's defenses could blunt that momentum. The stakes are global. Taiwan's fabs produce the lion's share of the world's most advanced chips, turning any cross-strait clash into an economic shock for every major industry. Beyond missiles and ships, the outcome could hinge on cyber warfare, semiconductor supply chains, civilian resistance, and logistics, factors that complicate the simple math of force. The scale of the 2025 military balance. When examining the hard numbers in 2025, the weight of China's advantage in military scale seems difficult to contest. Open-source defense tallies estimate the People's Liberation Army maintains roughly 2.03 million active personnel, while Taiwan fields around 169,000 by comparison. On the surface, this uneven match suggests Beijing holds dominance, supported by a vast arsenal that includes one of the fastest-growing navies in the world. That fleet now includes hundreds of surface combatants, modern destroyers, and multiple operational carriers, while the Air Force operates thousands of fighters and bombers spanning stealth to upgraded fourth-generation designs. Judged system by system, these figures make Taiwan's military appear outmatched. Yet appearances can mislead when they ignore the different strategies shaping each side's readiness. Taiwan's defenses are not built to match Beijing platform for platform. Instead, Taipei relies on what analysts describe as an asymmetric or porcupine strategy, the deliberate design of forces and infrastructure to complicate, delay, and impose unacceptable costs on any aggressor. Rather than chasing carrier groups or fleets of stealth fighters, Taiwan concentrates on survivability and denial. Underground air shelters ensure aircraft can disperse and re-emerge after bombardment. Mobile launch vehicles carrying precision anti-ship missiles can reposition among civilian traffic, making them difficult to track. Hardened hangars carved into hillsides create layers of resilience that blunt an adversary's numerical advantage. Another part of this strategy is Taiwan's steady investment in drones, which reshapes how limited resources can make an impact. Surveillance drones provide real-time targeting, loitering munitions can engage armored formations, and undersea drones serve as scouting and harassment tools against approaching vessels. These systems are cheaper and faster to produce than traditional jet fighters, which means Taiwan can generate swarm-like numbers that create problems out of proportion to their cost. Each drone may demand an expensive missile or interceptor to neutralize, turning scale into a potential liability for Beijing. Reserves add further complexity to the balance. While active forces are smaller, Taiwan supplements them with a reserve pool estimated at well over 1 million people. In 2025, officials announced reforms to expand and tighten reserve training, enabling faster mobilization and closer integration with regular units. This means that rather than relying on untrained civilians, Taiwan could reinforce its defenders with organized formations that extend staying power in a prolonged campaign. For an invader, this alters the arithmetic. Capturing urban strongholds or coastal terrain requires pushing through defenders who replenish faster than in previous decades. Logistics also introduce stricter limits than raw counts reflect. The PLA cannot simply move millions of troops into Taiwan at once. Amphibious lift capacity allows for waves of landings, not vast single strokes. Each wave of transports and landing craft would be exposed to air, missile, drone, submarine, and artillery fire, creating attrition risks along the strait. Modern mechanized warfare requires sustaining supply lines, yet amphibious convoys crossing confined waters remain vulnerable from the first crossing onward. Taiwan's planners assume that bloodying the initial wave slows tempo, delays advances, and complicates the timetable Beijing would prefer. Sea denial tools help sharpen that edge further. Rather than build a massive navy, Taiwan invests in submarines, including new indigenous models. Even a handful of these boats can threaten amphibious transports or surface fleets at choke points. In the confined geography of the strait, submarines force the PLA Navy to account for unexpected attacks beneath the surface, where surveillance remains imperfect. When paired with mobile coastal missile batteries, sea lanes become contested rather than guaranteed. All of this underscores why raw numbers, though striking, do not capture the military balance fully. China's forces are vast, but they are also tasked with wider responsibilities, from border security with India to patrols in the South China Sea. Not Every battalion or carrier group is free to pivot toward Taiwan at short notice. Taiwan, by contrast, directs all of its resources toward a single mission: survival. Its defense strategy accepts inferiority in scale, but leverages geography, technology, and resilience to erode the efficiency of overwhelming force. What emerges is not a simple graph of strength levels, but a contest between scale and survivability. Beijing commands a larger arsenal, but every stage of an invasion would meet a pre-positioned defense designed to trade space and time for costs. Taiwan cannot assure outright victory against a power of China's size, but it can make certain that rapid collapse is unlikely. That calculation lies at the heart of Taipei's deterrence, supported as much by its capacity to resist as by the impossibility for Beijing of executing a flawless, unopposed strike. The visible statistics, troop counts, vessel totals, fighter inventories, frame the headline conversation. Yet, as 2025 unfolds, another measure of strength surfaces in plain sight: the exercises and drills China carries out around Taiwan. These activities showcase numbers in motion, raising questions about whether they remain demonstrations or whether they mark the first steps of something more decisive. Rehearsals or harbingers. The meaning of China's drills. In recent years, China's military exercises around Taiwan have shifted from occasional shows of force into a recurring cycle of joint combat operations, raising a sharper question: are these drills meant as practice, as camouflage for mobilization, or both? The intensity and frequency of what Beijing calls combat readiness patrols across 2024 and 2025 have grown to unprecedented levels. Analysts warn these are rehearsals, exercises that mimic blockade tactics, encirclement scenarios, and anti-landing operations. By folding the Air Force, Navy, Rocket Force, and even the Coast Guard into these maneuvers, China has built routines that mirror the opening stages of a real campaign. A central theme in these patrols is encirclement. Chinese fighter jets and bombers now fly regular flight paths that circle Taiwan, while naval flotillas maneuver into positions resembling blockade lines. Missile forces join in with simulated strikes against command centers or energy infrastructure. Taken together, these operations showcase not only intimidation, but also a potential playbook, refined step by step in plain sight. Unlike earlier drills that were branch-specific or limited to waters near the mainland, these coordinated operations join multiple service arms into a rehearsal of joint operations, each one pushing the boundaries of what was considered exercise just a few years ago. The normalization of these movements adds to their strategic weight. Troop mobilizations, carrier sailings, and air patrols occur at such regular intervals that outside observers must constantly ask whether the next formation is routine or a precursor to war. By blurring those signals, Beijing gains room to mask mobilization. A sudden surge would not necessarily stand out if it mirrors the tempo and choreography of past drills. This ambiguity is itself a weapon, eroding confidence in timely warning and forcing Taiwan to respond to every large-scale movement as though it could be the one that matters. The pattern of encirclement also carries economic implications. Taiwan's reliance on imported food, energy, and raw materials makes it acutely vulnerable to interference in its sea lanes. Drills that simulate blocking commercial routes or patrolling choke points are not empty gestures. They amount to dry runs for a blockade strategy that could pressure Taiwan without immediate landings. Some exercises even signal preparation for cutting undersea communications cables, hinting at layers of disruption that could compound the pressure. Over time, Beijing collects valuable experience in sustaining operations over extended timelines, rehearsing logistics as much as tactics. Taiwan, forced to shadow these movements, pays a price. Each time jets are scrambled and missile batteries placed on alert, the strain on maintenance schedules, personnel, and readiness grows. Once or twice, the cost is manageable. But sustained over months, it wears down machines and operators in ways that accumulate. Beijing may see this as a form of attrition, applying constant pressure that gradually reduces Taiwan's endurance without any shots fired. Drills, in this sense, double as a grinding contest of stamina. The exercises also apply pressure on morale. Seeing warships off its coasts and aircraft fly overhead at a regular tempo has psychological consequences for Taiwan's population. Normalizing threats may foster resignation over time, creating an impression that foreign intervention is uncertain and that Chinese pressure is irresistible. For international audiences, the repetition builds a narrative of inevitability, one in which Taiwan is perpetually encircled, and Beijing holds the initiative. For Beijing, this is strategic messaging by demonstration. Instead of loudly declaring intent, it allows images of encirclement to frame expectations by themselves. Yet rehearsals cut both ways. Each mobilization opens Beijing's forces to close observation. Command structures, communication methods, refueling patterns, and operational weaknesses are visible to Taiwan and external intelligence services. Analysts note that logistics remain a recurring vulnerability. Keeping large formations fueled and coordinated in contested waters is no small feat when problems surface. Whether in refueling coordination or joint command integration, they can be cataloged for Taiwan's defenders to exploit. Each exercise offers Beijing practice, but it also gives opponents clearer insight into where failure may appear in a real war. Another danger lies in proximity and repetition. As Chinese aircraft cross into Taiwan's air defense zones or ships edge closer to territorial waters, the room for mistakes contracts. A pilot misreading a signal or a vessel colliding under tense conditions could escalate far beyond intent. This constant friction generates a persistent risk of miscalculation, one that Beijing may be comfortable tolerating because the friction itself advances its political aims, imposing constant pressure and shifting the boundaries of what is considered normal. Missile tests have become part of this disciplined routine. By firing ballistic and cruise missiles into surrounding waters, China communicates both capability and initiative. These launches demonstrate reach and accuracy while acclimating regional observers to a steady drumbeat of missile activity. The more often surrounding states and international organizations witness such tests, the lower their shock response becomes. Over time, measures that once invited condemnation fade into the background, leaving Beijing freer to escalate further without immediate backlash. For Taiwan, this steady escalation compounds the uncertainty. Each new cycle of activity raises the possibility that an actual blockade or wider attack would look identical to the last maneuver. Detection of intent becomes more difficult as practice merges with plausibility. Taiwanese military and civilian leaders must assume that any large-scale drill could be the real thing, committing finite resources to round-the-clock vigilance. That constant readiness imposes costs in fuel, manpower, and public comm. For Beijing, this blurring of lines is not accidental, is part of the intended effect. What also makes these rehearsals significant is the cumulative skill they provide. Commanders gain experience sequencing joint operations, pilots grow used to extended sorties in contested airspace, and naval crews practice long-range missions in conditions approximating conflict. Even if Beijing delays decisions about an actual offensive, the pattern of repeated exercises steadily raises the competence of its units. Each patrol adds proficiency that shortens the learning curve should actual conflict orders be given. Taken together, these maneuvers deliver three outcomes at once. They signal resolve to foreign audiences, they refine operational readiness for the PLA, and they erode Taiwan's confidence in the clarity of any warning system. The central danger is precisely this disappearance of thresholds. If day-to-day activity looks indistinguishable from mobilization, outside observers may only recognize an invasion when the first blockade is already in place. Taiwan is forced into a posture of perpetual alertness, a costly defense equilibrium that benefits Beijing by stretching finite resources thin. Ultimately, the question remains, are these drills rehearsals for war, camouflage for mobilization, or both at the same time? The answer may be all three, which is why observers treat every exercise as more than performance. For China, the utility lies in blurring meaning. For Taiwan, the danger lies in never being able to separate signal from noise. And for outside powers that watch closely, the challenge is distinguishing repetition from escalation without missing the first signs of something real. If exercises can disguise an attack, what would real warning look like? That is the puzzle planners grapple with even as Taiwan sharpens weapons of its own. Taiwan's new edge, drones, missiles, and indigenous submarines. At first glance, Taiwan's armed forces appear overshadowed by China's sheer scale, aging jet fighters, modest ground forces, and surface fleet that cannot hope to match Beijing ship for ship. But this is only the surface picture. In 2025, what matters is not Taiwan's ability to duplicate China's capabilities, but how it has reconfigured its defenses into a framework built on speed, concealment, and attrition. Smaller, cheaper, and harder to track weapons are now at the core of a deliberate shift away from matching Beijing's buildup. With limited resources, Taipei has focused on systems that can inflict steady losses while surviving long enough to prolong the fight. This recalibration was shaped by necessity. Taiwan's reliance on foreign arms deliveries has long proven vulnerable to shifting international priorities. Promised deliveries of fighters, tanks, and high-end missiles were repeatedly delayed. Faced with that reality, Taipei began investing in local industries and innovation programs that could deliver capabilities regardless of foreign bottlenecks. In March 2023, Taiwan unveiled several indigenous drone platforms, including the Albatross 2 and Cardinal 3 reconnaissance models, before scaling up domestic production. Those choices established the foundation of a defense strategy built to replenish losses faster than China could eliminate them, an approach favoring endurance over one-time blows. Drones illustrate this approach most vividly. Taiwan has openly described its strategy in 3 tiers. At the lowest level are small quadcopters, modified with improvised charges or cameras, designed for use by frontline units. They are expendable, easy to replace, and spread broad surveillance coverage. The second tier consists of loitering munitions, larger and longer endurance than quadcopters, but still cost-effective compared to precision missiles. These can circle over the strait waiting for transport ships or armored vehicles to reveal themselves, then dive onto targets with little warning. The third tier involves purpose-built surveillance and reconnaissance drones capable of operating at range, relaying live targeting data back to missile batteries onshore. Together, these layers disrupt command timing and complicate Beijing's already difficult amphibious plans. A swarm of small drones can overwhelm defenses, loitering munitions force constant vigilance, and longer-range reconnaissance ensures missile crews never operate blind. To make those systems credible, Taiwan adapted its industrial base. Rather than rely on line-by-line procurement from abroad, semi-automated factories on the island now produce drones and munitions in volume. Modular parts allow rapid assembly, while dispersed facilities limit vulnerability to any single strike. The approach is straightforward. Instead of banking on showcase hardware like stealth aircraft, Taiwan intends to maintain a steady, resilient pipeline of tools that erode China's attack momentum. Cheap drones combined with mobile missiles equal continuous attrition, an equation that favors defenders who plan for weeks or months, not hours. Missiles remain the centerpiece of this logic. Taiwan still employs imported systems such as Patriot batteries, but its doctrinal focus has shifted toward road-mobile strike weapons designed at home. Trucks capable of launching anti-ship missiles roll out, fire salvos, and conceal themselves again within minutes. Their range covers the entire Taiwan Strait, placing every amphibious ship under a zone of watch. Taiwan has also developed ground-launched cruise missiles that can target key airfields or embarkation ports along China's coast. These are not about wide-area bombardment, but about striking the critical hubs that enable an invasion to proceed. The operational payoff is simple. Staging areas and logistics hubs become vulnerable, complicating China's timetable and denying certainty of resupply. Survivability measures amplify this effect. Launchers are hidden among civilian highways and convoys, camouflaged by ordinary activity. Decoys and inflatable mock-ups further dilute China's targeting picture, forcing it to expend expensive missiles against false signatures. Stockpiles are tucked into hardened tunnels dug into Taiwan's mountainsides, surviving even the heaviest strikes. The result: Beijing cannot confidently eliminate Taiwan's missile force in a first wave. That constant threat alters the calculus. If ships and aircraft risk destruction at every stage, invasion speeds slow, and the possibility of failure grows. Another major development is below the waterline. Taiwan has advanced its Narwhal-class submarine program, a historic leap after decades of relying on a small number of imported, aging submarines. Industry analysts note Taiwan is fielding its first domestically built submarines, with one already nearing completion and more planned. Numbers may be small, but even a few vessels impose asymmetric leverage. The Taiwan Strait's shallow and noisy waters are difficult for advanced navies to police, making submarines in that environment especially hard to track. A single torpedo strike, sinking a transport ship, could scatter convoys and derail schedules. Submarines may be limited in fleet size, but each represents a persistent uncertainty factor for China's naval planning. One convoy loss could unravel an entire timetable for landings. Taken together, drones, mobile missiles, and indigenous submarines create a defense posture centered on denial, not parity. The strategy accepts Taiwan cannot outbuild China. It does not need to. Instead, it needs to make the crossing bloody, unpredictable, and drawn out. For Beijing, The risk shifts from a confident timetable of days to the possibility of a grinding struggle in which victory is uncertain. Each loss, an amphibious transport destroyed, a fighter ambushed, or a radar blinded by drones, adds friction Beijing cannot ignore. The operational reality is straightforward. Taiwan does not aim to field overwhelming armies, but to ensure every Chinese gain invites new risk. Cheap drones can force expensive responses. Hidden missile trucks can cripple ships. Submarines at a threat vector no blockade can reduce to zero. Together, they create a layered defense architecture built for repetition and sustainability. In short, the price of invasion rises with every stage, while the defender's ability to inflict damage regenerates faster than expected. By 2025, this posture reshapes how strategists assess Taiwan's odds. The outdated picture of an island awaiting inevitable collapse has given way to one of resilience engineered through innovation. Domestic factories provide continuity under pressure. Drone fleets provide constant eyes and teeth. Mobile missiles keep coasts contested. And submarines place the strait itself under shadow. What was once a flat imbalance of forces now looks more like a contest over whether China's scale can overcome Taiwan's capacity to make every step costly. This shift also reframes the invasion challenge. China may build massive fleets and expand drills, but what it confronts is not a mirror image foe, it is a defender optimized for disruption. A sudden strike is less likely to decapitate defenses because the defenses themselves are built to regenerate. Taiwan cannot defeat China in total war, but can break the rhythm China needs to succeed quickly. For planners, that means a campaign grows longer, bloodier, and more complicated by the day. Yet even with these new tools, Taiwan's chances rest on more than technology. Geography, climate, and simple physics still impose the ultimate barrier to invasion timelines. China may possess vast forces and rehearsal experience, but the geography of the Taiwan Strait presents obstacles no innovation can erase. And it is there, in the narrow waters off Taiwan's coast, that the next element of the problem comes into view. The geography trap: strait, coasts, and weather. Crossing the Taiwan Strait may look simple on a map, but the reality is far more difficult. At its narrowest point, it is about 130 kilometers wide, and at the broadest, close to 220 kilometers. Modern ships or aircraft can cover these distances in hours, yet an invasion is far more than just transit time. Analysts at the Council on Foreign Relations describe such an operation as the most complex military undertaking in modern history. What makes this short stretch of water so challenging is not distance alone, but the currents, weather systems, and coastlines that dictate when and how large forces can even attempt to cross. The strait is rarely calm. Seasonal pressure systems dictate its rhythm in ways that no commander can ignore. The summer monsoon, from May through September, brings typhoons, heavy rains, and sudden storms that restrict naval maneuverability. The winter monsoon, from November through March, drives cold winds down from the north, creating steep waves that make amphibious landings dangerous or even impossible. Only brief windows in late spring or early autumn tend to offer conditions calm enough for mass transport. These windows are narrow, and the unavoidable fact is that they are predictable. Taiwan's defense planners monitor these seasonal cycles closely, meaning that any buildup in Chinese ports timed to align with a weather window would be highly visible long in advance. Surprise is difficult when the calendar itself signals opportunity. That visibility presents one of Beijing's largest disadvantages. Massing an invasion fleet would involve moving hundreds of transports, landing craft, supply ships, and escorts into position. The logistics behind fueling and arming such a fleet leave clear signatures in satellite imagery, open-source photography, and even commercial vessel tracking data. In practice, the preparation cannot be concealed. Every barge waiting offshore or every column of vehicles moving toward embarkation points becomes evidence. Taiwan, already on high alert during favorable months, would have weeks to anticipate and prepare tailored defenses. Unlike an attacker, Taiwan's forces are already dispersed on home territory, waiting out of sight in mountainsides, underground hangars, and fortified depots. For the crossing itself, exposure is the central hazard. Amphibious ships, no matter how well armed, must spend hours sailing across open waters fully within range of Taiwan's arsenal. Mobile missile launchers can strike from the coast and then vanish underground. Drones and loitering munitions can stalk slow-moving landing craft. Submarines can position along likely transit corridors, waiting for convoys to pass. The transit cannot be rushed. Crossing 130 to 220 kilometers with hundreds of slow vessels requires long hours of vulnerability. Every kilometer covered is another opportunity for defenders to inflict losses that throw timetables off balance. Weather conditions magnify this vulnerability. High seas scatter tight formations, stretching the distances between transports and escorts. Fog and heavy rain reduce the effectiveness of air cover, leaving convoy decks exposed. Fighter aircraft attempting to protect landing fleets may find themselves grounded or limited by turbulence and poor visibility. A commander balancing these factors faces hard choices: gamble on imperfect conditions with increased risk of dispersal and uncoordinated landings, or wait for calm spells that Taiwan will be expecting. Timing, once again, strips away the element of surprise. Geography near Taiwan's coastline compounds the invasion problem. The western shore is lined with tidal flats, silt deposits, and shallow approaches, many of which cannot support the weight of tanks and heavy vehicles. The number of viable beaches is small, and those locations are well known. Taiwan has fortified them with defensive barriers, pre-sighted artillery zones, minefields, and coastal missile batteries. Attempting to push through under fire at one of these limited points concentrates Chinese forces exactly where Taiwan is strongest. It also means that invaders are funneled to narrow corridors where even moderate defensive fire can cause devastating disruption. The terrain beyond the beaches is not forgiving either. Many of the suitable landing sites lead directly into urban sprawl, cities and towns dense with narrow streets, high-rises, and civilian populations. Urban environments slow advances dramatically, providing natural cover for defenders and making armored maneuvers difficult. A landing force cannot easily regroup on open ground before entering combat, is forced from ship to city under pressure. Every block presents potential ambushes, snipers, and improvised defenses, while supply convoys lagging on overstretched beaches face their own battles. Time lost fighting through urban terrain works against attackers and in favor of defenders consolidating. Inland, the difficulty of choosing landing zones only multiplies with the need for scale. To seize a foothold, Beijing must either spread its troops across several beaches or concentrate them heavily in a small number of corridors. Dispersal risks weakness at every location, allowing Taiwan to repel each smaller assault piecemeal. Concentration, while stronger, produces its own problem: the massing of troops and ships into narrow funnels where defenders know to aim. Either approach clashes with the logistic limits of amphibious lift, which forces multiple waves rather than a single overwhelming first strike. Those repeated waves are each exposed to attrition while crossing, and loss of tempo in one wave throws off the timing of the next. Resupply is the unavoidable bottleneck. Even if the first landings succeed, maintaining them demands convoy after convoy sailing back and forth across an exposed strait. Food, ammunition, armored vehicles, and medical supplies all must arrive by sea. Taiwan does not need to sink every ship. If defenders delay or destroy enough transports, the flow collapses. Shortfalls in ammunition or fuel quickly stall advances inland. Unlike continental wars, where reinforcements march forward unhindered, every stage here must recross hostile water under observation. Sustaining momentum becomes as challenging as achieving the first landing. Taiwan's geography also influences how each side allocates readiness. Defenders can conserve strength through most of the year, focusing energy on likely invasion months when weather and tides align. China must maintain mobilized forces for longer, holding soldiers and equipment in a state of readiness awaiting clear skies, risking fatigue, cost overruns, and morale erosion if delays persist. Time works as a weapon for Taiwan. Months of waiting without resolution weaken an attacker's precision planning, while short bursts of readiness allow defenders to optimize their alert cycle at manageable intervals. When all of these factors are combined, the strait's shifting weather systems, the scarcity of usable beaches, the unavoidable visibility of staging, the constant exposure of convoys, and the resilience of defenders already in place, the geographic conditions take on more weight than the raw kilometers alone suggest. What looks like a short water crossing becomes a gauntlet of endurance. Each obstacle compounds a last, and the risk that a single miscalculated wave could unravel the entire plan is significant. This is why many military scholars emphasize that Taiwan's location functions as a natural force multiplier. The strait funnels attackers into predictable corridors. The coastlines reduce options. The weather strips surprise. The logistics stretch every reinforcement cycle. Geography does not guarantee Taiwan's survival, but ensures any invasion attempt unfolds under permanent pressure and permanent visibility. For Beijing, sheer numbers cannot erase these structural barriers. But geography is only one obstacle. Beyond coastlines and monsoon cycles lies another dimension of modern conflict, one fought in networks and signals rather than waves and tides. Understanding whether Taiwan can resist may depend less on beaches and storms, and more on what happens before the first fleet departs. Because there's another battlefield, invisible yet decisive, where cables, satellites, and power grids will determine whether Taiwan's defenses fight as one nation or collapse into silence. Cyber, satellites, and the invisible front. Before warships ever approach Taiwan's shores, another contest would already be underway. One fought across networks, satellites, and the unseen systems that bind modern societies together. This is the arena of cyber operations and counterspace warfare, where strikes are delivered without warning, and where control matters as much as destruction. In 2025, the question is never if such tools will be used, but whether they can tilt the balance enough to disrupt Taiwan's ability to fight as a single unit. Beijing has invested heavily in building one of the world's most capable cyber forces, organized for far more than espionage. Chinese operations have repeatedly targeted Taiwanese agencies and companies, probing defenses for weaknesses. In a crisis, these capabilities would likely be aimed at core systems, government communications, banking networks, transportation grids, and military command channels. If malware or denial of service attacks disable those networks, the effects ripple outward. Radar screens may flicker with gaps. Civilian power nodes may fail at critical moments. And society itself may slide toward paralysis when services no longer function. A clear vulnerability lies beneath the waves. Taiwan depends almost entirely on undersea fiber optic cables for its external digital connections. Recent reports, including a 2023 incident where two of Taiwan's cables to Matsu were severed, likely by passing vessels, underscore how fragile this infrastructure is. Analysts warn that in wartime, China could task research or commercial ships with cutting key lines, isolating the island digitally. If international connections collapse, Taiwan would lose rapid access to allied intelligence, financial flows, and emergency coordination. Information would shrink just as speed and clarity matter most. Satellites form the other half of this invisible battlefield. Taiwan relies heavily on foreign constellations for missile warning and navigation. Meanwhile, China has expanded its own space-based intelligence and surveillance systems, while also testing counterspace technologies, jammers, directed energy weapons, and anti-satellite missiles. A deliberate campaign in orbit could jam GPS guidance, interfere with early warning, or even disable the satellites feeding Taiwan and its partners' essential data. If radar images and tracking feeds vanish, fleets at sea may move unseen, missile salvos may arrive unanticipated, and strike accuracy may suffer. Cyber and counterspace strikes by themselves won't win the island, but they can paralyze command, split defenses, and create decision paralysis. The danger is not that Taiwan's forces vanish in one blow, but that they are reduced to isolated units reacting without a shared picture of the war. A communications cutoff between coastal missile batteries and command centers could delay launches by crucial minutes. If drones lose real-time satellite support, their value as precision spotters falls sharply. Fighters sent into the air may find their radars distorted by jamming, opening corridors for China's aircraft to slip through. The goal for Beijing is coherence breakdown rather than pure destruction. A network of defenders degraded into scattered cells cannot mass firepower at the right time. Even fully functional missiles and aircraft lose effectiveness when cut off from coordinated command. This is the paralysis China seeks. Defenders trapped fighting bravely, but disjointed, while the larger offensive gathers pace. Taiwan, however, has not ignored this threat. Over the last decade, it has invested steadily in redundancy. Command facilities are dispersed deep inside hardened bunkers to reduce single-point failures. Backup communications are reinforced by commercial satellite partners, creating fallback options if undersea links go down. Encryption adds protective layers to data streams, while civil and military agencies now participate in routine cyber drills to test contingencies. The aim is not seal every gap. The consensus is that no network is invulnerable, but to ensure vital systems can limp forward even under attack. Concrete examples reveal what this might look like. Should hackers disable portions of Taiwan's civilian grid, hospitals revert to backup generators while transport slows. Such practical consequences erode confidence faster than statistics. A city plunged into blackout, even for 24 hours, produces images that can be amplified by Chinese messaging campaigns to convey helplessness. Civil resilience in these scenarios is as vital as military endurance. If people believe they are cut off from the outside world, morale drains even if soldiers continue resisting effectively at the front. Allies add both opportunity and risk. Taiwan depends on American and Japanese satellites for early detection and maritime awareness. If China jams or directly threatens those space assets, it risks dragging outside powers further into the conflict. A cyber strike on US or Japanese systems to blind Taiwan is no longer a local operation. It becomes a direct confrontation with global consequences. That calculus forces Beijing to weigh whether disabling Taiwan's external vision is worth the escalation risk. From Taipei's perspective, the answer is to prepare for inevitable disruption by decentralizing. Commanders train under the assumption that headquarters may go dark or orders may be delayed. Units are encouraged to continue striking at known targets, relying on local initiative rather than constant oversight. This doctrine of fragment and fight is how Taiwan intends to function even when networks collapse. In effect, every company and platoon is expected to operate as if isolated, while still aligning with an overall defensive mission. What is unknown is how long China could sustain a coordinated cyber and counterspace campaign. A few hours of disruption can be patched with backups, but days or weeks of internet cutoff and satellite interference gradually undermine Taiwan's ability to act. Allies may struggle to assess conditions when local nodes fail. Foreign decision-makers may hesitate without clean intelligence. In protracted degradation, confidence falters not only in Taipei, but in the capitals it depends upon. So this invisible front does not offer an easy road to victory, but it shapes tempo and perception. By splintering digital coherence, Beijing seeks to slow responses, exhaust civilians, and push Taiwan into a reactive crouch. If those strikes succeed, momentum tilts toward quick seizures. If Taiwan's backups hold and local initiative sustains resistance, the balance flips toward extended conflict. Either way, the contest over networks and satellites will decide how clearly each side sees the unfolding war. Yet Taiwan's future hinges on more than secrecy and signals. Behind the digital front sits another domain where the island holds global leverage, not one of missiles or software, but of microscopic circuits etched onto wafers. And what is contested there may matter, as much as armies or fleets in shaping whether Beijing risks the gamble of war at all. The semiconductor factor, fighting over the silicon lifeline. Taiwan's leverage in a cross-strait conflict is not confined to submarines, missiles, or drones. Its greatest source of influence may lie in the global economy, etched into silicon. In 2025, Taiwan produces more than 60% of the world's advanced semiconductors, including the smallest and most powerful chips used in smartphones, cars, cloud computing, and precision military systems. Taiwan supplies the lion's share of the world's most advanced nodes. Replacement capacity in other countries will take years and tens of billions of dollars to build. The concentration of such a critical industry in one place has been described as Taiwan's silicon shield, a deterrent rooted in chips rather than troops. But this shield is fragile. In any attempt to seize Taiwan, the semiconductor industry would become the most coveted prize and the most exposed target. The vulnerability begins with the nature of semiconductor production itself. High-end fabrication plants, or fabs, depend on ultra-clean rooms, uninterrupted power and water, and a steady supply of rare gases and chemicals. These facilities are not warehouses that can simply be seized and restarted under new management. They require precision equipment, much of it produced by a handful of firms abroad and tightly controlled by export regimes. Even routine disruptions can derail operations. A brief power outage or single contamination incident can ruin entire batches of chips. This fragility means that in a wartime setting, with bombardment nearby and utilities under cyber attack, keeping fabs running smoothly is nearly impossible. For Beijing, the implications are double-edged. On one side, Taiwan's semiconductor dominance represents a strategic prize. China depends heavily on imported chips, especially those needed for artificial intelligence, advanced communications, and modern weapons. Gaining control over Taiwan's output would reduce this dependency. On the other side, any invasion risks destroying the very capability it seeks. Semiconductor facilities cannot withstand the shock of occupation without environmental stability, specialized inputs, and intact supply chains. Even if Chinese forces manage to seize territory around Hsinchu or Tainan, the fabs themselves could become useless shells. This makes the idea of capturing Taiwan's chip-making capacity intact more fantasy than probability. The paradox deepens when the global consequences are considered. A collapse in Taiwan's production would ripple through industries everywhere. Automakers could find themselves with stalled assembly lines, aviation firms would experience part shortages, and telecommunications networks would struggle to expand. Components essential to US and European defense contractors would suddenly vanish from supply chains. Markets already sensitive to disruption could spiral into volatility. Analysts warn that an extended interruption would hit harder than the global supply chain shocks of the pandemic, this time spreading directly across both civilian and military sectors worldwide. For Taiwan, this global dependence is intentional. Policymakers in Taipei long recognized they could not outmatch China militarily, but they could make themselves economically indispensable. If the world relies on Taiwan's chips, then the world has an interest in Taiwan's security. The downside is obvious. Fabs are not easily defended assets. They cannot be buried deep underground like missile launchers, nor can their delicate machines be relocated quickly. This creates a dilemma. What makes Taiwan valuable also ensures that in conflict, its most important industry could be the first to fall. The fragility of the sector is not limited to direct strikes. The ecosystem of semiconductor production depends on continuous external inputs. Purified gases, ultra-pure water, chemical compounds, even transportation links for finished goods, all must function in tandem. War threatens every step of that chain. Cyber attacks can cut utilities, missile strikes can damage pipelines or logistics hubs, and financial sanctions may slow the import of equipment spares. Even without a single bomb hitting a fab, disruption of these support structures can shutter production lines. 4. Beijing. This means the industry is almost impossible to inherit by force. For Taipei, it means the same industry invites destruction. The stakes for the global economy explain why other states have begun hedging. The United States has invested heavily in new fabrication projects through legislation and subsidies. Japan has poured billions into attracting joint ventures, and several European states support domestic foundries. Yet all of these efforts remain years from completion. Semiconductor production cannot be replicated overnight. It requires not only machinery but highly trained engineers, production culture, and accumulated expertise. By 2025, Taiwan still stands as the primary hub for cutting-edge chips. Any interruption to its facilities, even temporary, would shake economies across continents. This interdependence sets the stage for geopolitical consequences. If a cross-strait conflict threatens chip supplies, governments and corporations worldwide would not remain passive. Diplomatic protests would almost certainly be followed by economic actions, sanctions, export controls, and financial measures designed to penalize China. Some nations might even consider material support for Taiwan not simply on moral grounds, but to safeguard their own economies. Chinese leaders are fully aware of this calculus. An attack on Taiwan is not just military escalation. It is a disruption with global reach. Still, the deterrent effect of semiconductors is not absolute. Beijing may calculate that other nations, no matter how dependent, will hesitate to risk direct confrontation. Officials could conclude that while chip shortages inflict hardship, the pain might be tolerated if weighed against strategic gains. Some in Beijing may even accept that fabs would be destroyed in the short term, believing that long-term reconstruction under Chinese control could restore capacity. For Taipei, this is a strategic paradox. Semiconductors are both shield and vulnerability. They compel global attention, but cannot be defended against destruction if war begins. The credibility of the silicon shield relies less on the industry itself than on how foreign governments interpret and respond to its potential collapse. This tension raises the central question for Taiwan's security. Does its semiconductor dominance deter aggression or tempt it? Advocates of deterrence argue that no rational actor would gamble with a facility so critical to the global system. Others warn that the same centrality makes the fabs a magnet, a prize whose capture, however destructive, seems worth the risk from Beijing's perspective. In one scenario, outside powers act swiftly to defend Taiwan because their economies are tied to its output. In another, they hesitate, assuming they can adapt and endure shortages. Both interpretations remain plausible, and both shape Beijing's risk calculations. Ultimately, Taiwan's semiconductor industry embodies more than economic strength. It is a geopolitical fuse. The fabs at Hsinchu and Tainan are not merely factories, but nodes tying together global trade, technology, and military readiness across continents. Their fate in any invasion attempt would reverberate far beyond Taiwan itself. If production is disrupted, the consequences spread instantly through financial markets, supply chains, and strategic planning from Washington to Berlin to Tokyo. For analysts assessing conflict scenarios in 2025, the semiconductor factor sits at the center of the debate. The question is not only how Taiwan's defenders would resist on beaches and in cities, but whether the risks to this fragile and irreplaceable industry alter Beijing's willingness to attack in the first place. That uncertainty links Taiwan's local defense to global stability. And it is here that another question inevitably arises. When such stakes are at play, how far will other powers go to act on Taiwan's behalf? The role of the U.S., uncertainty as strategy. In any discussion of Taiwan's survival, one question looms larger than any other. How far would the United States actually go if China launched a war across the strait? In 2025, the answer is being left deliberately unclear. Washington voices a steady commitment to peace and stability in the Indo-Pacific, but it stops short of offering a binding guarantee. This intentional uncertainty lies at the heart of U.S. strategy. By keeping its role ambiguous, Washington avoids giving Taipei reason to declare independence under assumptions of automatic protection, while also ensuring Beijing cannot operate under the belief that America will remain on the sidelines. The legal foundation of this ambiguity lies in the Taiwan Relations Act, passed in 1979. The act commits Washington to providing Taiwan with defensive arms and to maintaining the capacity to resist coercion, but it does not obligate the United States to intervene militarily if China attacks. It leaves the decision of direct involvement to the President and Congress. This lack of clarity is not an oversight, it is deliberate, reinforced by decades of policy choices that balance deterrence with restraint. Taiwan is not afforded the certainty of a treaty ally under NATO's Article 5, yet the law ensures the island cannot be ignored. For Beijing, this creates a dilemma. American forces might move to defend Taiwan, but no one knows for sure until the moment of crisis. China's leadership studies not only U.S. policy documents, but also its track record in past conflicts. American forces have demonstrated the ability to mount rapid deployments to the Middle East, to run sustained naval patrols across global waters, and to conduct large-scale air campaigns from distant bases. These examples prove capability, but capability is not the same as intent. Xi Jinping must weigh whether Washington would risk lives and resources for Taiwan, knowing that the cost of misjudgment could undo any invasion before it achieves momentum. The very uncertainty forces caution, but it also leaves open room for catastrophic miscalculation. This question intertwines with the nuclear balance. Any full-scale conflict over Taiwan could escalate into a confrontation between two nuclear powers. For U.S. decision-makers, open intervention means accepting even a small chance of nuclear escalation, an outcome no administration would treat lightly. For Beijing, the uncertainty lies in whether Washington is truly prepared to assume such a risk to prevent Taiwan from falling. Neither side declares where its ultimate red lines lie. That silence itself sustains deterrence, but keeps all parties on edge. Yet ambiguity is not the same as inaction. Washington has steadily taken practical steps to close gaps in readiness without crossing into explicit commitment. U.S. forces have expanded stockpiles of ammunition, fuel, and spare parts in Guam and Japan. Facilities in northern Australia, including Bandiana, have been developed to preposition equipment as part of broader joint planning. These moves are not hidden. They serve as visible reminders that American logistics capacity is positioning for high-intensity operations in the region. Naval patrols continue through contested waters in the South China Sea, and U.S. destroyers regularly sail near Taiwan, demonstrating familiarity with the operating environment. Presence does not equal a promise of intervention, but it signals preparation. Alliances further magnify the uncertainty. Washington does not plan in isolation. Treaty commitments with Japan and the Philippines mean the United States would be operating alongside partners during any crisis. Access to bases in Okinawa or Luzon could allow aircraft and ships to disperse across multiple points, complicating China's targeting options. Coordination with these partners has included joint exercises and updated agreements that reflect a shared concern about China's assertiveness. For Chinese planners, this raises the stakes. Intervention may not be strictly bilateral. It could involve a coalition of regional states aligned with Washington. That possibility amplifies the risks of miscalculation. But cooperation is not automatic. Domestic politics play a role in every allied capital. Public opinion in Tokyo or Manila may hesitate in the face of escalation. Leaders must navigate between supporting Washington's security objectives and addressing public caution about being drawn into open war. This creates a second layer of uncertainty. Not only must Xi Jinping assess whether the United States might intervene, he must also judge what its allies would permit or refuse. Each layer of doubt complicates decision-making, which is precisely the purpose of America's deliberate ambiguity. For Taiwan, this environment requires constant hedging. Its leaders cannot assume foreign intervention will arrive in time, nor can they dismiss the possibility. Taiwan's doctrine is designed for endurance, to fight past the first days of an assault. The logic is straightforward. The longer Taiwan resists, the more time American leaders and their partners have to rally options. Each additional day without Chinese victory increases the chance that outside forces decide to intervene. This explains why Taipei invests heavily in asymmetric systems and dispersion, not only for battlefield resilience, but as a mechanism to create time for wider diplomacy and potential assistance. The concept of strategic ambiguity is often criticized as indecision, but in practice it functions as strategic calculation. Washington signals, prepares, and positions, but it avoids locking itself to a path. Clear commitments could embolden Taipei or provoke Beijing prematurely. Total silence could invite Chinese aggression by creating the perception of disinterest. Between those extremes lies calibrated uncertainty. The effect is a deterrent that depends less on what Washington says than on what Beijing cannot predict. This balancing act, however, carries risks. The same ambiguity that deters rash moves can also cause dangerous misreadings. China may convince itself that hesitation in Washington means passivity, only to encounter intervention once combat begins. Conversely, Taipei may overestimate the speed or scope of U.S. involvement, creating plans that falter if help arrives later or more cautiously than expected. Both scenarios carry existential consequences. The strength of ambiguity is also its weakness. Deterrence without guarantees means stability bolstered by uncertainty, not certainty. The broader reality is that America's own credibility is on the line. A retreat from Taiwan without response would reverberate through alliances across Asia and beyond. Yet committing openly risks escalation at a level not seen since the Cold War. This is why Washington deliberately maintains its dual posture, visible readiness, but restrained promises. Navy patrols, forward logistics hubs, and ally consultations all suggest preparation. Yet official language resists binding guarantees. Every signal carries weight, but none erase uncertainty. For Beijing, this dynamic means that no invasion plan can ignore the shadow of U.S. involvement. Every calculation must account for the possibility of American ships sailing in support or American bombers launching strikes from regional bases. The scale of consequences, even if uncertain, becomes part of the calculus itself. For Taiwan, it means survival depends not only on its own forces, but on how long it can hold out and whether hesitation tips into intervention. Ambiguity restrains action, but also carries the risk of grave miscalculation. And while Washington's signals may weigh heavily, the question of Taiwan's fate does not rest on America alone. The regional partners surrounding the island, each with their own obligations and limits, could prove decisive. Regional allies, Japan, Philippines, and the Crescent of defense. If fighting ever erupted over Taiwan, the island would sit at the center of a much wider geometry. Its location anchors shipping routes that stretch from Japan down to the Philippines and into the South China Sea, creating what military planners often call a crescent of defense, a loose arc of neighboring states whose proximity ensures they cannot entirely ignore a conflict in the strait. The uncertainty in 2025 is not whether these countries care about Taiwan's survival, but how much they would translate that concern into active measures if crisis came. Japan is positioned at the northern tip of this crescent, and its closeness to Taiwan makes distance an illusion. Yonaguni Island, Japan's westernmost outpost, lies less than 110 kilometers from Taiwan's coast. For years, Tokyo has treated this geography as a strategic vulnerability, increasing its defense budget to levels not seen in decades and expanding purchases of systems like the F-35B to bolster strike and response options. Japan has also invested in land-based anti-ship and cruise missile programs, explicitly designed with ranges to cover approaches into the East China Sea. The takeaway is straightforward. Proximity alone forces Japan to prepare. It cannot sit untouched by events only a short flight from Okinawa or Kyushu. The tactical implication is that Japanese bases, whether voluntarily or by necessity, would become operational nodes in any U.S. involvement, offering runways and launch points, even if Tokyo calibrates its exact role carefully according to domestic politics. The Philippines occupies the southern flank of the Crescent, and its geography is equally critical. The Bashi Channel, the passage running between northern Luzon and Taiwan, is one of only a few deep water routes linking the South China Sea with the Pacific. Any Chinese attempt to enforce a blockade south of Taiwan would pass directly through these waters. Manila's importance in 2025 is heightened by the expansion of the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, which now grants U.S. forces access to 4 additional bases across Luzon and other islands. This tangible arrangement means American aircraft and logistics units are already positioned closer to Taiwan's southern approaches, transforming the Philippines into a staging ground whether Manila fully embraces combat operations or not. The key point is that Manila does not need to send divisions north to shape events. Simply hosting American forces at Luzon air bases changes the map. Still, the Philippines must balance Chinese economic pressure and domestic politics, so the depth of its role remains uncertain. At minimum, U.S. access to Philippine sites ensures the southern arc of Taiwan's defense cannot easily be ignored. South Korea sits further north, outside the Crescent's direct arc, but still part of the regional equation. Seoul's primary focus remains its confrontation with Pyongyang, a reality that absorbs much of its planning and resources. Yet geography gives South Korea indirect exposure. Its energy imports and trade pipelines pass through or near the Taiwan Strait. A blockade there would disrupt its economy immediately. For these reasons, South Korea has avoided a public role in Taiwan's defense debate, instead signaling quiet support for U.S. contingency planning. The practical contribution would not likely be carriers or combat brigades, but logistics, allowing backfill of American forces on the Korean peninsula, sharing intelligence, or supporting at a distance so that Washington can move units southward. In essence, Seoul helps by ensuring forces are not stretched thin in both theaters. The takeaway is caution. South Korea will not openly become a frontline actor in Taiwan's defense, but indirect support could be vital for sustaining a longer campaign. Australia anchors the arc further out, providing depth rather than proximity. Though distant from Taiwan shores, Canberra has tied itself more tightly into U.S. and British defense frameworks through AUKUS, gaining access to future nuclear-powered submarines and deepening integration of logistics and defense industrial capacity. From northern bases like Darwin and Tyndall, Australia offers the United States locations outside the immediate reach of Chinese missile barrages. This makes Australian territory a natural fallback site for U.S. resupply, repair, and reinforcement operations should forward bases in Japan or Guam become compromised. The clear takeaway is that Australia contributes not by proximity, but by depth. Secure space for staging and replenishment across a conflict that might grind far longer than days or weeks. On a tactical level, that means supply networks, munitions pipelines, and industrial repair for damaged ships and aircraft. When viewed together, the Crescent of Defense is neither a locked alliance nor a staged plan. Each state has its own interests and constraints. Japan moves toward assertiveness because geography leaves it little alternative, yet the degree of direct strike participation still lies in Tokyo's hands. The Philippines hosts foreign bases that reshape the tactical map, but must navigate domestic politics and heavy Chinese investment in its economy. South Korea weighs the risks of antagonizing Beijing against its reliance on straight trade, choosing quiet support over overt declarations. Australia extends reach and depth, anchoring an outer ring that gives Washington room to maneuver. This uneven mixture creates both strength and fragility. The strength lies in the map. Taken together, Allied bases ring Taiwan from north and south, complicating any Chinese attempt to isolate the island. Even symbolic support or restricted base access forces Beijing to account for wider operational arcs and disperse threats. The fragility lies in politics. Hesitation or disunity among allies would fragment the Crescent into partial links, reducing its value as a regional bulwark. For any defense planning, the question is less about the existence of a Crescent than about whether it aligns into tangible collective action. Taiwan's own strategy is shaped by this uncertainty. Survival is not just about its drones, missiles, or submarines, but about how quickly partners in the Crescent lock into visible, coordinated measures. Each additional day of resistance increases the incentive for allies to act and the time for bases, ships, and aircraft to be drawn into the theater. Conversely, a rapid collapse could leave little room for regional decisions to mount. Timing and perception become as decisive as weapon counts. All of this underscores that Taiwan's defense is layered. Missiles under mountains, foreign bases across the Crescent, distant supply lines stretching to Australia. But the arc of states is made of governments and electorates, each calculating risk. Their choices, not just geography, will define how wide the battlefield becomes. Yet external allies are not the only variable China would face. The resilience of Taiwan also depends on forces and reserves that cannot be measured by ship counts or treaty clauses. Beyond missiles and bases lies another layer entirely: the determination of millions of civilians who would live through bombardment, blackouts, and occupation, and whose choices could decide whether the fight ends at the shoreline or endures in streets and valleys for years. Civilian resistance and the fight beyond the battlefield. When measuring Taiwan's staying power, the focus often falls on missiles, drones, and submarines. Yet the decisive factor may rest with the 23 million citizens who live on the island. Armies fight battles, but it is populations that absorb the impact of war. In Taiwan's case, ordinary people have been woven into national defense planning, turning civilian resolve into a pillar of deterrence. In 2025, analysts no longer frame this as a secondary issue. It is a recognized part of how Taipei intends to resist aggression. For years, Taiwan has fortified not only its military assets, but its everyday infrastructure to prepare society for shocks. Key bridges and tunnels have been designed with reinforcement and redundancy to stay functional even under bombardment. Power stations and water facilities include alternative supply lines, while urban areas maintain expanded networks of shelters to protect civilians during strikes. Notably, some of Taiwan's hardened air bases, like the underground shelters near Chiashan and tunnels south of Jiai, demonstrate how both military and civilian continuity planning overlap. The principle is that if people can keep living, working, and communicating through disruption, an adversary is denied the decisive collapse it seeks. Civilian involvement feeds into this resilience directly. Reserve units have been broadened to include volunteers alongside those with prior service. Annual training cycles introduce thousands of people to first aid, basic military drills, and crisis logistics. Reserves are a crucial link between frontline soldiers and civilians, forming a middle layer that can be mobilized quickly. Current estimates put Taiwan's reserves between 1.5 and 1.66 million, with government plans in May 2025 to add another 20,000 trained personnel. While not all will be combat ready, even partial mobilization transforms society from a passive target into an active defense system. Taiwan has also considered scenarios where conventional defenses give way. Its interior is dominated by a spine of mountains offering cover to irregular forces. Anticipating this, authorities have prepared caches of supplies in rural areas, while some volunteer groups have trained in guerrilla tactics. Insurgency planning assumes that even if coastal defenses fell, occupation forces would face a persistent resistance embedded in difficult terrain. Underground networks could sabotage supply lines, harass convoys, and make long-term control costly. As modern conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan showed, occupying populations resistant to assimilation places immense burdens on superior militaries. Taiwan has drawn these lessons into its planning. The central uncertainty is how ordinary people would act under fire. Skeptics sometimes argue that Taiwan's modern, urbanized population might prioritize survival over resistance. Others counter that a strong national identity, hardened by decades of pressure from Beijing, would compel widespread defiance. In 2025, data provides clearer guidance. Several polls report that more than 75% of Taiwanese express willingness to defend the country through military service, support roles, or even nonviolent resistance should invasion occur. This figure undercuts assumptions of rapid civilian collapse and instead points to high potential for societal mobilization. National identity programs underpin this commitment. Expanded service for young people now includes not only basic drills, but also community coordination, disaster relief, and crisis management. Such training broadens the defense perimeter into everyday life, ensuring that in war, schools double as coordination hubs and communities can self-organize to maintain services. The concept is that resistance is not confined to professional soldiers, but distributed across society. When each person has a defined role, resilience spreads horizontally, increasing the costs an occupier must bear. Taiwanese citizens have also drawn lessons from global conflicts. The 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine and the sight of civilians joining territorial defense units or improvising supply networks left a lasting impression on the island. The lesson was not that courage guarantees survival, but that ordinary people can meaningfully slow a superior adversary. This example shaped how Taiwanese populations began imagining their own response, not as passive victims, but as participants in a collective defense effort if crisis arrived. Modern defense also extends into the digital arena. Taiwan has developed training programs to counter disinformation and psychological pressure. Public awareness campaigns teach citizens how to spot false narratives, reducing the risk of panic if propaganda floods social media during bombardment. Civilian literacy in information warfare is a critical hedge against attempts to fracture morale. Occupation forces may face not a confused or silent population, but one that can still coordinate narratives, share verified updates, and maintain cohesion even under digital attack. Endurance, however, hinges on supplies as much as morale. Taiwan has made careful provisions of food, medicine, and energy reserves designed to keep civilians sustained under blockade conditions. Starvation, shortages, or systemic blackouts force populations to surrender faster than military defeats. To guard against this, Taipei has built stockpiles capable of carrying society through weeks of isolation while seeking international assistance. These reserves aim to buy time for morale to hold, time for allies to decide on responses, and time for resistance actions to organize. Challenges remain stark. Not all training reaches every community, and levels of readiness differ between urban and rural centers. Psychological resilience will be tested if services collapse in the largest cities. And confidence in eventual support plays a quiet but powerful role. Populations resist more strongly if they believe outside allies will answer. Taiwan's leaders have openly acknowledged this, framing resistance as endurance until external actors can influence the outcome. The operational implications of civilian resistance are direct. Any occupying force faces pressure across multiple dimensions: sabotage of supply routes, protests in streets, irregular attacks from blending militias, and demands for constant policing of urban centers. These actions multiply force requirements, strain logistics, and turn military victories into administrative nightmares. For China, success would require not just defeating Taiwan's army, but pacifying its entire population under conditions of sustained hostility. Resistance does not collapse with initial defeats. It prolongs conflict, forcing an invader into a prolonged, expensive commitment. This broader picture links civilian resolve to deterrence. Beijing must weigh not only the risks of amphibious assault, but also the endurance of a society where the majority of adults are prepared in some way to resist occupation. The prospect of prolonged insurgency raises costs far beyond battlefield planning, deterring hasty decisions that assume quick capitulation. Civilian defense is thus not a backstop, but an integral layer of deterrence, complicating any invasion calculus. Military capabilities count, but Taiwan's greatest defense multiplier lies in how its population intends to respond under pressure. With millions committed to roles that range from supporting logistics to resisting occupation, the adversary's task is transformed from invasion to governance of a hostile island. And that shift brings its own dangers, because even if China succeeded in landing troops, it would still face the daunting question of what comes next: the post-invasion nightmare holding the island. Landing troops on Taiwan would mark the start, not the end, of the hardest phase of war: the struggle to hold and govern a resistant island. Capturing beaches or ports is one matter. Enforcing lasting control over cities, mountains, and population opposed to occupation is something far more complex. Military experts note that conquest is often easier than consolidation, and modern history, from the Soviet War in Afghanistan to U.S. campaigns in Iraq, shows that the costs of holding territory can exceed those of taking it. For Beijing, even if the initial assault succeeded, the challenge of stabilizing Taiwan would likely prove far greater. Taipei, as the capital, exemplifies this difficulty. Its dense layout with millions of residents, narrow streets, and clusters of high-rise towers is the kind of terrain that favors defenders. Even weakened conventional units could convert the city into fortified networks of ambush points and barricades. Modern militaries find that clearing such environments demands exhausting, building-by-building combat, in which every intersection can delay progress. For an occupying force, this is more than a military issue. It also becomes an administrative one. Supply convoys running through choke points invite harassment, while supporting an urban center of this size requires constant manpower. Taipei alone could drain personnel and resources at levels Beijing might not anticipate. Beyond the capital, Taiwan's geography turns hostile quickly. The Central Mountains split the island lengthwise, offering natural bases for insurgent groups and escape routes for civilians turned fighters. Guerrilla tactics thrive in such terrain. Small units can move with local knowledge, attack supply depots or roads, and disappear into difficult countryside before larger forces respond. Mechanized formations, designed for rapid maneuver across open terrain, struggle against this kind of warfare. The paradox grows steeper. The more ground Beijing seized, the more troops it would need to disperse across an unforgiving landscape, diluting combat strength and leaving units perpetually stretched. Logistics deepen the trap. Supplying an invading force requires repeated sea crossings, not a single bridgehead. Each wave of Chinese convoys delivering food, fuel, and ammunition across the strait would remain exposed to Taiwanese missiles, drones, submarines, and even small, unmanned surface craft. Research on amphibious warfare emphasizes that logistics interdiction is a constant threat, especially given the limited lift capacity across 130 to 220 kilometers of contested water. Any disruption at sea could ripple instantly through units inland, creating shortages that stall operations. Occupying Taiwan would mean sustaining a perpetual lifeline across hostile waters, an enormous liability with no easy protections. Administration would multiply difficulties. Taiwan is a developed democracy with its own institutions and civic culture. Removing those structures does not eliminate them, it replaces them with gaps. Local officials may refuse to cooperate, while teachers, community leaders, and civil servants either resist quietly or sabotage openly. Occupiers that attempt coercion feed greater resentment, swelling underground networks. Political control in such a society is not a matter of issuing decrees, but of constant monitoring that consumes huge amounts of manpower. In parallel, every crackdown invites international condemnation, widening sanctions, and diplomatic isolation. Instead of gaining legitimacy, Beijing would project the image of an oppressor locked in endless confrontation with civilians. Technology accelerates these pressures. Taiwan's population is digitally connected, and information flows quickly even if primary networks are disrupted. Civilians could share evidence of crackdowns, resistance, or failures through smartphones, encrypted messaging, or improvised relay systems. Beijing would struggle to suppress these broadcasts entirely. Images of repression would travel internationally, galvanizing support for Taiwan and fueling sanctions campaigns against China. In practice, every attempt at information suppression would risk magnifying Beijing's loss of credibility abroad. Economically, occupation is at least as punishing as combat. Infrastructure damage from bombardments must be repaired to claim normalcy, yet sanctions and isolation would cut off many of the materials and technical imports needed. Taiwan's factories, particularly semiconductor facilities, might shut down from combat damage or sabotage, depriving Beijing of the very prize it sought. Rather than collecting economic gains, an invader could inherit liabilities, millions of embittered citizens to support, a paralyzed industrial base, and decaying infrastructure in need of costly reconstruction. Instead of integrating Taiwan into its economy, China might find itself hemorrhaging resources to maintain even basic functioning. Politically, protracted occupation would reverberate on both domestic and foreign fronts. Casualty lists from insurgent ambushes and grinding urban battles could erode public patience inside China, where officials would need to defend a war that does not end. Internationally, Beijing's credibility as a rising economic power would dim, replaced by the image of a military occupant mired in suppressing civilians. Nations hesitant to confront China today would find it harder to remain neutral when streams of imagery show repression on a modern democracy. An attempted demonstration of strength could translate into isolation and economic decline. For the military itself, morale would face steep decline. Soldiers trained for conventional force-on-force conflict could find themselves relegated to checkpoint duties, patrols through neighborhoods waiting for improvised attacks, and months of tension among a hostile population. Sustaining discipline in such conditions is a challenge documented in multiple modern occupations. engagement rules blur, unit cohesion frays, and effectiveness falters. Every garrison requires endless rotation, supplies, and replacements. Instead of rapid victories, the reality becomes protracted attrition, born not by battlefield opponents, but by the stresses of occupation. What emerges is a strategic trap. The more forces are committed to control Taiwan, the more resources and political energy are drained. Military planners refer to this as the post-invasion dilemma. Victory on beaches or in air duels creates headlines, but that victory collapses when viewed across decades. Occupying Taiwan would anchor Chinese forces indefinitely, weaken its external posture, and sharpen opposition abroad. Historical lessons reaffirm this. Occupations that appeared successful at first, whether Soviet troops in Afghanistan or coalition forces in Iraq, transformed over time into costly, unsustainable commitments. Analysts often highlight this trap as the most overlooked danger in Beijing's calculus. Amphibious operations themselves are daunting, but even those pale in comparison with the requirements of extended control. Holding Taiwan would demand massive garrisons, ceaseless convoys across contested seas, constant suppression of an organized civilian network, reconstruction under sanctions, and political battles at home and abroad. The price of occupation could escalate beyond even the most pessimistic forecasts of invasion itself. So even if Chinese forces manage to seize ground, the deeper question lingers: can Beijing govern what it takes? The economics, politics, and logistics of occupation suggest a burden that may outweigh any immediate military success. And that calculation points to something larger, because the struggle over Taiwan may hinge less on battlefield triumphs than on the unseen pressures that follow once those battles end. The outlook for Taiwan in 2025 highlights more than military power. It reflects the layers of risk surrounding any invasion attempt. Geography and asymmetric defenses ensure that early landings would be costly. Cyber strikes, space assets, and semiconductor supply chains push the conflict's stakes far beyond the strait, giving it global weight. And the prospect of occupation, combined with uncertain Allied responses, means any operation carries potentially crippling consequences for Beijing. In short, the military math, fragile industries, and political risks make an invasion a gamble with potentially ruinous returns. What do you think, quick strike or long quagmire? Tell us in the comments.